material. So that if there is the introduction of offensive material, sexual material into the correspondence, that must come from your suspect. All you may do is, if something is introduced, you may reflect it back. So if something is said, then you can then say that back. But what you must not at any stage do is you mustn't ratchet it up.
I fell into that trap of writing these letters, and the more letters I wrote of a sexual nature, I kept putting in each one, is this what you want? Is this what you're interested in, you know? And I was basically trying to find out what was really going to turn her on, you know? And it didn't matter what I wrote, you know, it just wasn't, you know, doing it for her. She wanted more extremes, you know.
After more than 3 months of exchanging letters, Lizzie James and Colin Stagg finally began talking on the phone. The conversation turned to Rachel's murder.
I was suspected of it, you know. I want to tell you, like I told everybody, you know. I've never done anything, you know. But, you know, I was frightened of telling that right from the beginning because, you know, because a lot of people do suspect I did it, and it's playing on my mind, you know. Because what was the rumours as well that went with it and that.
The pair arranged to meet in Hyde Park. The day before, Paul Britton had sat down with Lizzie James. She was advised to reveal she had a dark secret.
Managed to get out of her what her so-called dark secret was, and she had confessed to me, you know, that she was involved with another man who's a Satanist, and they were involved in satanic rituals, and it turned her on sexually, and she even admitted to killing an innocent woman on an altar with, you know, a pregnant woman, and then killing the baby as well. And all I kept thinking about was, well, basically, she's a good-looking woman. And that, yeah, I didn't believe a word she said, you know. I just thought she wasn't all there. She was mentally unstable.
But undercover officer Lizzie James's confession of murder didn't elicit a confession of murder from Stagg.
She, Lizzie James, was egging him on, and he wasn't coming up with the answers that the police and you and Lizzie James wanted, was he?
I had no answers that I wanted. I mean, it was, if you like, from a technical point of view, a matter of indifference whether or not the man gave answers that took the case forward in the police's way or eliminated.
So you weren't convinced at this stage that Colin Stagg was the murderer of Rachel Nickell?
My comment to the police and the Crown, the QCs and others, was that even if your suspect, Colin Stagg, goes all the way through this and at every step of the way meets every criteria that I have suggested would be present in the killer, but not present in someone who isn't the killer. If every single one of those is met, that doesn't make him a murderer.
But police were convinced Colin Stagg was the murderer. On August the 17th, 1993, the decision was made to arrest him.
Tonight, several police forensic experts moved into Colin Stagg's neat garden in southwest London and started digging deep holes.
At Wimbledon Police Station, the investigating team presented Colin Stagg with the evidence gathered during the undercover operation.
Then look at the fantasies as they progressed as you've written to Lizzie James. The increasing deviance, the increasing domination, the increasing violence, the need to humiliate and dominate.
Stagg was about to realise that the woman he had been meeting wasn't a potential girlfriend, she was an undercover policewoman.
Do you remember this letter now, Paul? The man then goes over to his pile of clothes and produces some string and a knife. Up until this point in time, I have never mentioned a fantasy with a knife with you. Up until this point in time, I've never mentioned a fantasy to you. Do you remember that? And you told me the police had shown you photographs of how Rachel Nickell was lying at the time she was murdered. And you, in fact, lay down in that position. You lay down like a baby, like this. Do you remember? You curled and you had your hands like this. And you told me that her head was tilted back slightly, like this. Do you remember? Do you remember that, Colin?
I knew then I was really being set up, and the police were doing everything they possibly can to get this case against me. And all I kept thinking about was, well, it's a murder charge, you know, you've got to have one scrap of evidence, and there was not one scrap of evidence linking me to this crime or any crime, because I hadn't done anything. I thought, you can't put a man in prison just because he wrote dirty letters to a woman who asked them of him.
But Colin Stagg was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell. Police called her partner, Andre Hanscom, now living in France with his son Alex, to break the news.
What were your thoughts then? That this was finally over?
Relief that this was going to come to some kind of conclusion, much earlier than many people had led me to believe. Confusion and bewilderment as well, because obviously it's another whole process to try and absorb. First of all, you have, the very day itself, and now you have the actual concrete realization that this is the person that did it.
Except it wasn't. Rachel's real killer was the same man who had been raping women along the Green Chain Walk. Another link between the two cases was Paul Britton, the criminal profiler for both investigations.
It was common sense, in my view, that they were linked. And yet you've got a professional psychologist saying they're not linked. And that's why probably he got the reception that he got when he came and briefed our team, because I saw him, and I know some of the others that I spoke to saw him as valueless.
But today, Paul Britton says he did make a link.
The thing that struck me about the psychological profile is how similar it was to the one that had been provided for the Rachel Nickell case. I mean, it's not identical, because people do things in slightly different ways at slightly different points in their lives. But my view was that these two are so similar that you're looking at the same person.
And that person wasn't Colin Stagg, it was this man, Robert Napper, one of Britain's most notorious serial killers.
Robert Napper is a modern-day Jack the Ripper. There are the sexually sadistic elements. There's the consistent use of a knife and the pleasure in using a knife. There's similar aspects to the behaviours in targeting victims. And a central difference in that targeting is, whilst the Ripper attacked prostitutes, Robert Napper attacked young mums.
But 3 years before Rachel Nickell's death, there had been the first in a series of police blunders, which meant Robert Napper had slipped through their grasp.
In 1989, after I think the first rape in the Green Chain series, a woman who was Robert Napper's mother went to the police and said, "My son has confessed to me that he's raped a woman." It was true that a rape had taken place and that Napper had done it, but the police were given the wrong location for it. So when they consulted their records, they thought, this is very odd, we don't have a report of a rape in this location.
And he was about to slip through the net again, after police issued an e-fit of the Green Chain rapist in August 1992. Both a neighbour and a work colleague of Robert Napper called police.
So they wanted him to come into the police station to give a DNA sample. Now, had he done so, then that would have been game over. They would have known straight away that he actually was a rapist, and the whole sequence of events could have been stopped. But, in fact, what happened was Robert Napper declined to come in and give a DNA sample. So once again, the police, in a very what appears to be a fairly lackadaisical way, suddenly thought, oh, here's a chap who should have come in, but he's twice failed to show for appointments to do this. Well, we'll send some people round to knock on his door. So two fairly junior officers went round, knocked on his door, had a chat with him, decided there and then that anyway, on description, he looked to be 2 or 3 inches too tall to be the man being described in these rapes. And, in fairly summary circumstances, they decided, well, it can't be him anyway.
This catalogue of mistakes was about to cost another young mum and her daughter their lives. By the summer of 1993, the Green Chain investigation, starved of resources, was losing momentum. Meanwhile, the energies of the Rachel Nickell investigation were focused on the wrong man, Colin Stagg. He was awaiting trial at Wandsworth Prison. It meant Robert Napper, Rachel Nickell's real killer, was on the loose, and he was about to kill again. Detectives investigating the murder of Rachel Nickell on Wimbledon Common thought they had found her attacker. Colin Stagg was behind bars and awaiting trial. But Rachel's real killer was planning his next attack. He'd already committed a series of rapes in the months before Rachel's death. Now, with police focused on Colin Stagg's trial, he was stalking his next victim. Samantha Bissett lived with her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine just a mile away from Robert Napper. One day she complained to her boyfriend Conrad Ellum that she'd seen a man watching her late at night.
Looking back, it seems crazy that I didn't react more at the time, I suppose. That Sam had actually said this. One night she looked in and there'd be someone looking in through the window. And then it didn't happen again. I mean, I made a point of being around more at the time, afterwards.
Weeks later, Conrad discovered a scene of unspeakable horror.
As soon as I opened the door, there's this big sort of stain on the carpet, this big dark stain. And I look at that and think, you know, what's going on here? And I thought, well, maybe someone's got spilt, but I couldn't think what. I thought paint or varnish or something like that. And I thought, well, maybe go and try and find something to clean up with. So I went in the kitchen, and there was a cupboard in the kitchen where Sam used to keep her clothes. And that had been pulled open, all the clothes had been pulled out, and the whole kitchen floor was carpeted with Sam's clothes. I thought, well, that's just as strange as the carpet. I mean, what's going on? And I stood there for quite a while, looking at all these clothes and the stain, and thinking, oh, had been burgled or what? Didn't know what it was. And I walked from the kitchen, there's a hallway, and then I walked into the living room. And sort of Sam was there. I mean, she was mostly covered up. I didn't really see anything particularly traumatic. I read the descriptions of, you know, what Robert Napper did to her, but because he covered her up with all clothes and blankets and things, there wasn't really much to see. Just sort of her arms and legs sticking out. But I think I realised, obviously then I realised what had happened. And I thought, well, I better phone the police. And it was only when I was out of the room that it occurred to me that I hadn't seen Jasmine. I thought, is Jasmine in there? And I didn't want to go back into the room to look for Jasmine. I thought, well, no, I'll stay out of that room now. So I looked in the bedroom, and Jasmine was in the bed, but there again, her duvet was pulled over her, so, you know, but it didn't look as if she was breathing.
Detective Superintendent Mickey Banks was one of the first officers on the scene.
As I walked through the door, there was people inside the house, people who had first gone to the scene, and I walked through to the dining room, and this body was displayed. I mean, it was the most horrendous scene I've ever seen in 32 and a half years police service. It was awful. You know, it was as if a post-mortem had been conducted on this poor young girl. It was absolutely horrendous.
Samantha had been stabbed to death before being mutilated. Her daughter Jasmine had been sexually assaulted and smothered. It later emerged the killer had even taken away part of Samantha's body as a trophy. Conrad, initially considered a suspect, appealed directly to the killer at a press conference soon after the murders.
If you're out there, which I think you probably are, could you possibly write to me via the police or something and tell me why you did it?
There were now 3 separate teams at the Metropolitan Police investigating the crimes of Robert Napper. The Rachel Nickell team had targeted the wrong man. Colin Stagg was behind bars on remand. Officers from the Green Chain team had interviewed Robert Napper but failed to get the DNA sample that would have connected him to the rapes. Now Mickey Banks at the Samantha and Jasmine Bissett inquiry wondered if their killer and the Green Chain rapist could be the same man.
It was quite obvious to me and a lot of people that could our rapists have turned into a murder, which is quite a normal event for a serial killer or a serial rapist, that he progressively gets worse and worse and more violent.
Mickey Banks decided to enlist the help of a criminal profiler. It was the same man who had worked on the Green Chain rapes and the Rachel Nickell investigation, Paul Britton.
And exactly what Paul Britton said to us was what my officers believed was the person responsible, was a person that didn't relate to women, who was a bit of a loner, perhaps had minor previous offences before, of low intellect, And this is the normal thing that you seem to get from clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. There was nothing new to me.
But armed with this